It's the study of the biblical flood. I'm Marion Fox, the instructor. This is our 59th lesson. We'll finish this, should finish it next fall. And we'll have another 12, 15 lessons or so after this. We're going to break after tonight until August. So we won't be having classes for the next couple of months or so. So we're in chapter 14 of the book. And we're looking at what's called extrapolation. Now, I know this gets into a little mathematics, but basically extrapolation is when you know an equation, or you think you know an equation for a process, and you have points you've measured, and then you take it or calculate those points, and then you extend them beyond into the future or backwards into the past. And so you're assuming something about your mathematics. You're assuming that you know the correct formula for the process, and you're assuming that the things in the variables in the formula are not changing somehow, so that they're not variable, they don't change with time or change with some other process. So the atheist wantonly, without regard, extrapolates present process backward in time. And so they assume that the processes have been either constant, or that even if it's a variable, that is a nonlinear equation, they assume that that formula has not been changed by some process. Most of the extrapolation that they do or perform is linear. That is, they assume that the process is unchanging and it's linear. It's a constant process. And of course, that gets into one of the very first things we dealt with was uniformitarianism, substantive uniformitarianism. And the present is the key to the past. That's the statement. You'll find that in book after book after book. And I've seen it in book after book, and it's really a statement of uniformitarianism, substantive uniformitarianism, which we studied earlier. Now, they're totally inconsistent. We're going to show their inconsistency in extrapolation. Extrapolate some processes, but they don't want to extrapolate all processes. And that they're inconsistent. They want to extrapolate backwards with any information. The atheistic assumptions of the Earth being over 4 billion years old. So they won't extrapolate those processes. They come up with saying, well, we can't explain why it's not continuing that way, but there must have been a reason. There must have been a reason because we've assumed the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, approximately in that neighborhood. A number of atheists have used linear extrapolation for variables that do not vary in a linear manner. Now, this is understandable with someone who doesn't have a math background. It's very easy to do that. But most of your geologists really don't have a lot of math in their curriculum. I've looked at the curriculums of geology, and they don't have a lot of mathematics in it. But they have enough mathematics, they should know better than to do this. But nonetheless, they take variables that vary in a nonlinear fashion and treat them as linear. When this is done, the whole procedure, once they take a process that's not linear, by linear, I mean, if you double the time, you double the process, you double the action. For instance, if you're talking about erosion of sediment in the Mississippi River, for example. If you take the sediment that's deposited 1 year or 10 years or 100 years, and then you take it for 200 years, if it's linear, it should deposit twice as much sediment 200 years as it does in 100, 3 times as much in 300 years as it does in 100 years. And that's an assumption, see, that it's linear, uniformitarian. Atheists will deny substantive uniformitarianism. Now, they've given it up because of other evidences of such things as impact of bolides and things of that nature. But they're inconsistent because when they make the claims, the claims of the process are based upon substantive uniformitarianism. We've already pointed this out repeatedly. And so they're extrapolating and making that assumption, which they don't even believe to be valid. They're either ignorant of the irrationality of the process or they're dishonest. It may be one of the reasons geologists are trying to hang on to substantive uniformitarianism. Some of them are trying to. That may be part of the reason. They won't extrapolate the decay of the Earth's magnetic field backwards because it would contradict their assumption of 4.5 billion year old age for the Earth. Now, let me point out, assumption has been made that the decay of the Earth's magnetic field, which it is decaying, that it is decaying in a linear fashion. But I pointed out the physical processes, when they are linear, they're not decaying in the base E in logarithmic form, or base E to some power. E is the base natural logarithm of 2.71828 approximately. When they're not decaying according to that equation, formula such as that, then in a nonlinear fashion, they generate through Fourier analysis, Fourier analysis, it generates a series of harmonics. And so one of the problems we get into, if the Earth's magnetic field is going back and is decaying in a linear fashion, as they claim, then it should generate harmonics. And these harmonics would make it look like there are variations or there are fluctuations in the pattern. It would actually create oscillations, which would be plus and minus and reverse polarity. So that would reverse the polarity. And that would explain the reversals, apparent reversals that they see. And so, but the problem is, if they project it backwards too far and let it be linear, they're going to have these fields so strong that it's going to cause the Earth's crust to be molten. They came up with the claim that the magnetic field has reversed respond to this problem, right? Yet they have no mechanism whereby this could have occurred. The mechanism by which the magnetic field was generated or is generated or began is unknown because the processes, dynamo theory and so forth, just don't work out. Don't work out. Our problem that we run into is this, and I know it was written by a professor at El Paso, Texas, at the university there, University of Texas, El Paso, and his book, and he claimed that it was set in motion with by God at the beginning of the creation, and it would just be a decaying exponential, like a capacitor discharging, and so we get this logarithmic process, basically e to some power process. They ask the theists, now understand, they say, well, we don't have a mechanism for it. But they'll ask the believer in God, a theist, to give a mechanism for every phenomenon, but cannot even give a plausible theory for the reversal of the magnetic field of the Earth. Now, that's disingenuous. That's not consistent. So what they're doing is they're saying, well, you have to give us an explanation for everything you say happens, but we don't have to with you. And so that's kind of hypocritical. It's not consistent. It's not rational to do that. And so it's called special pleading in logic. I plead for you to let me get by with it, but I'm not going to let you get by with it. Now, according to Shipman, Wilson, and Todd, which I cite, there is no known mechanism that would reverse the magnetic field of the Earth. There's no known mechanism. Page 681 of the book. I taught out of this book for several years in college. The atheist will not extrapolate the shrinkage of the sun backwards. We've talked about in the last lesson the shrinkage of the sun. They won't extrapolate it backwards because, and as physics today says, the shrinkage must be transitory. Well, why is it the argue it's transitory? Because we would have already seen geological evidence in a long-term contraction. So we know the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and in that period of time, we showed, I believe last week, that in 10 or 11, depending on whether it's a radius or diameter that's shrinking, either 11 million or 22 million years, the Earth would be inside the sun, and of course, it'd be burned up. So the Earth, they say, well, we know it's 4.5 billion years old, and it would have been inside the sun in 11 or maybe 22 million years. So that can't happen. So we'd have seen geological evidence of it. Well, it's possible that they have the dating wrong. And that's part of the problem here. They've made that assumption, and they won't even look at the possibility that this negates their claim of the ancient Earth. And remember, there's no magnetism with reverse magnetic field. Keep that in mind. The atheist will extrapolate the shrinkage and backwards. He has no mechanism whereby the shrinkage could occur but not continue for several million years, but he asserts that there must be such a mechanism because he knows the Earth is over 4 billion years old. Again, he starts with that preconceived notion, and this discards all the empirical information. Remember, the shrinkage of the sun is based on based on true science, empirical measurements for several hundred years in different locations. And so there's no reason to doubt the empirical information. Now, if the processes continue, and they are continuing, then we have a problem with it. If we extrapolate it backwards in time, 11 million years, the Earth would be inside the sun, be too hot. In fact, in 1 million years or so, it would probably be too hot because the sun would be further out. So that shrinkage would be a big factor. Atheists won't extrapolate backwards in time the bombardment of the solar wind upon moon rocks. And so the solar wind bombards moon rocks and it won't extrapolate it. They argue the rocks are turned over by some gardening process, they call it, of meteorite impacts. Well, a meteorite coming in certainly could turn rocks over because they can measure the solar wind in measurement in the rock. The solar wind is particles, usually protons, but could be the nuclei of helium atoms, the protons and the neutrons coming from the sun at high rates of speed. And when they hit an object, they will, of course, go into it and embed themselves into it and cause damage to it. Cosmic rays coming in can do this, and these could be larger particles even, okay? The high energy particles of the solar wind leave trails in the rocks as they enter the rock and can be seen with electron microscopes. So these trails can be actually seen with electron microscopes. I've never used an electron microscope, but I've been around where they were using them and observed them being used, and peeked over their shoulder and watched and listened and asked questions about it. But I've never actually used one. Burgess says, since the radiation appears to have been quite constant, so he claims that solar radiation, solar wind, has been constant. Quite constant, he says. It can, in turn, be used as a kind of a depth of suntan technique to find out how long the rocks have been exposed to the solar wind and to cosmic radiation. So, with the depth of it will determine, like a suntan technique, how long it's been exposed. This technique reveals how long a rock has been on the surface, which is usually less than a few million years, according to their dating. And how long it has been within inches, 10 centimeters. A centimeter, well, 1 inch is 2.54 centimeters. So 10 centimeters, you divide that by 2.54 and you get inches. Pretty close. That's a good close approximation. And it's usually between 1 and 10 million years. So they say these rocks are turned over in less than every million years, 10 million years. The solar flares are used for the first measurement. And the deeper penetrating cosmic rays are used for the second. So they use solar flares and cosmic rays. Now the solar flares occur on about an 11-year cycle, if my memory is right. So they're cyclic, they cycle. And then we have other actions of the sun that are cyclic. There's a pattern of about a 50-year cycle for some other actions of the sun. So there's several patterns that we have. He goes on and tells us track density show that buried samples were once exposed to the surface, but have been turned over by the lunar gardening process. Now, of course, what they're assuming is all of this has continued like it began in the beginning. Now, our problem with this is my flood model would have the moon bombarded with a lot of debris when the flood was going on and just before it began. And so we'd have the far side of the moon bombarded first and pockmarked or cratered. And then the near side would be cratered from debris that was occurring during the flood. For solar flare tracks, scientists estimate how long a sample from them was exposed to the surface. Cosmic ray tracks, how long it is within a few centimeters of the surface. And for meteorite impacts, how long it remained in deep surface layer. So again, they make assumptions about this. What do they assume? They assume that the cosmic rays are constant, that the solar wind is constant, and the meteorite impacts are a constant. That is, there's a certain number of them each year, and they project that backwards. But the flood model I have would throw that all out the window. It's evident that the amount of penetration of the solar wind is at least 1,000 times less than one would expect for rocks that experience 4.5 billion years of exposure to the solar wind. So they have to have this gardening process, that is the turning over of the rocks because it just won't give them enough time. So he theorizes the gardening process. He doesn't see it and know it occurs, but he theorizes it, and his process is due to meteorite impact. And the rocks are turned over by the forces of meteorites. So it's a theory. Again, they don't have actual evidence of it. It's not true science. It has to be true, or something to that effect has to be true, because they've assumed a 4.5 billion year old Earth, and both moon is approximately the age of the Earth, according to their view. And so all of this should have occurred in that approximately 4 billion year life of the moon and 4.5 billion year life of the sun, of the Earth. But he cannot extrapolate the effects of the solar wind backwards for over 4 billion years without having sensitive problems in his system. Can't do it. So it throws out this whole 4.5 billion year period. The rocks don't show it. Even according to their dating system, it's only a few million years, not billions. It's off by a factor of 3 orders of magnitude. Let's be 1 order of magnitude would be 10 times, 2 would be 100, 3 would be 1,000 times. The atheist will not extrapolate, furthermore, the erosion of the continents backwards in time either. We dealt with that in the prior lesson. Why? Because the erosion should have leveled the continents and deposited them into the oceans. Should have occurred. Now, another problem with this, the erosion is so fast that fossils shouldn't be more than just a few million years old. Shouldn't have any fossils in it. Kennedy discusses several problems with geology, and this is a geologist with regard to the erosion of continents. Kennedy states, the fourth problem, this is his fourth problem, he states, that of a long lifetime of continents and mountain ranges is perhaps the most difficult of all now. Why is it? He tells us the rivers of the world strip tremendous quantities of rock debris off the continents each year and deposit in the oceans. The great rivers are steadily weighing down their basins. At this time, all the landmass areas will be eroded to sea level in something order of 10 to 25 million years. So all of the land mass that would be eroded down to sea level in that time, 10 to 25 million years. Well, why aren't they eroded down to sea level? And of course, how could you have any fossils older than 25 million years? They should have eroded away. Shouldn't be able to find fossils older than 25 million years. If it's 10 million years, you should be able to find them fossils that are older than 10 million years. That's what he's telling us. Now, this is a geologist. Don Prothero state North America is now being eroded to rate the level in a mere 10 million years. They give the lower order 10 million years. It is clear that in the past, the rate of erosion and or the volume of land above the sea has on average been much less than now. How is it clear? This is Don Prothero. How is it clear? Well, we know the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and it hasn't eroded away, so something has been different. See, again, they're not extrapolating backwards this process. It's a process that they see that's basically pretty close to a linear, pretty close to a linear process. Should be able to just double the time, you double the erosion, double the sediment in the rivers. But that's not the case. And so our problem we get into is there's an inconsistency on the part of the atheist. It's data that they have measured. That's empirical data. That's true science. And so they won't project it backwards. They won't extrapolate it backwards. The Mississippi River Delta is not large enough to be several hundred million years old. It's not, can't occur. In fact, it should have eroded away. Years. Kennedy states further, the Mississippi, for example, contains about 0.5% of solids as it flows into the Gulf of Mexico. Each year, it brings to the Gulf of Mexico approximately 750 million tons of dissolved and solid material. So the Mississippi River Delta, the delta at the end of the river, which enters the ocean, by that I mean the Gulf of Mexico, it is constantly more material there. So this is a fact. And so it's 1/2 of 1% of that flows in is solids. It's sediment. So there's approximately 750 million tons of dissolved and solid material each year that goes into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, what does the atheist say? Well, I know this Mississippi River has been flowing for several million years. So my problem is, how can I still have the Earth billions of years old and not have eroded away all of the American continent? Well, the problem is, he says, well, I don't know. Some unknown factor changed the deposition rate. Okay, that has to be the case, or we wouldn't have any. But he's never dealt with the question of how did he have even fossils? If the whole of the continent should have been eroded away in 22 million years, two of them say 10, one says 10 to 22, and the other one says 10 to 25, and the other one says 10 million years. Let's just take the 25 million. It should have been eroded away in 25 million years. Shouldn't be any fossils older than that. And shouldn't be the continent. We shouldn't have the mountains. Another way he will answer is to claim that something raised the ocean beds and chased them into dry land. Well, the problem with it is, and we've already laid this out, the continents rest on what's called it's like a tooth, the root on a tooth in our teeth. It sticks down into magma. It's floating in the magma. Now, if it's going to float, according to Archimedes' principle, it should be less dense than the magma that's floating in. That's just simple physics. That's physics 101. And Archimedes' principle is. So if it's floating in the magma, it's less dense than the magma. Now then, how in the world do we get this to sink? And supposedly this has sunk down in the magma and let the oceans run over top of it to deposit sea creatures, marine creatures, and then raise back up to let the terrestrial creatures, land-based creatures, be deposited on it in the sediment, in the fossils. So we got marine sediment, marine fossils, then we got terrestrial fossils, and we have marine fossils. Well, this will fit a tidal flood with no problem, but it won't fit their system because you got to put light material on the bottom of it's called a craton, like a tooth like a root of a tooth in your teeth, and so it sticks down into the magma. Something has to raise it up. So that means you have to put light material on the bottom of it. And then that's to raise it up out of the magma. And then to let terrestrial fossils be deposited. And then you have to lower it back down into the magma. The only way you do that is put heavier material on the bottom of it. Pull it back down. And then that's to let marine creatures be deposited. And then raise it back up again to get terrestrial creatures. And there's cycles between terrestrial and marine creatures. There are layers of rock, several different layers. Now, a problem is, can you raise these continents up and down when the cratons are thought to have been constant from almost the beginning? It won't work with simple physics 101. Plain old general physics taught in freshman level classes at the universities. Just won't work. And if we get the principle of isostasy, and that's what I've been talking about, isostasy. It's of ethos, and it's how it stands. Ethos is the same. So that principle of isostasy we talked about earlier, many lessons ago. The position of sediment in the ocean, lower the ocean floors rather than raising them. Why we should make them sink down. It should raise them. Now, here's Wilson. When one considers that this geology book, when one considers that in a country so well mapped as Switzerland, this is the nation of Switzerland, the competent Swiss geologists have often been able to predict in advance precise arrangement of the strata to be found in a railway tunnels a few thousand feet below the surface. One is forced to conclude that geological observations, while valid enough, are not of a type that lend themselves to extensive extrapolation. Okay, you can't extrapolate. So when they go down and drill through these rocks, put railway tunnels down through the mountains, it's a mountainous country, Switzerland is, and they want to run a railroad tunnel through the mountain. Problem is, they can't figure out what kind of rock's going to be next when they drill through it. There's no way of telling. So he says, one of the forced to conclude, and they can't, they're unable to predict in advance. I'll put my mouse on it where I'm reading. The precise arrangement of the strata to be found in the railway tunnels a few thousand feet below the surface. We just conclude, he says, that their observations, though valid enough, are not of a type that lend themselves to extensive extrapolation. So he's saying, well, we can't accurately extrapolate with our geology, our layers. Now, Kennedy says the erosion of continents to sea level in order of 10 to 25 million years should totally destroy all continental drift. Now, remember, we had cited another source that said 10 million years. I'm going to go with this one. It's liberal I can with them. it should totally destroy all continental drift or plate tectonics evidence from fossils. They claim there's evidence from fossils of the linkage in South America and Africa at some point. And they may have been linked at one time before the flood. I believe the Bible teaches the land was in mass before the flood. But we'll have to go back and look at that in more detail. Here, if it's something that happened more than 25 million years ago, the continent should have been eroded away. You should be able to find the fossils. Shouldn't be the fossils on both of those sides of South America and Africa that would show and would link the two continents together. Just shouldn't be there because it should have eroded away. So your evidence of plate tectonics, one of the evidences is destroyed. One evidence, not the only one, is the supposed fitting of continents of Africa and South America and the supposed linkage of fossils, other evidence. The drift of the continents was supposed to occur in the order of several hundred million years, not 25 million years, not 10 to 25. But the continents would have been eroded in less than 25 million years. So you shouldn't be able to find any evidence of, well, from fossils at least. There should not be any evidence, geologic or otherwise, to link the continents of Africa and South America together. It shouldn't exist. If it occurred 100 million years ago, and it should have eroded away in 25 million years. Shouldn't be there. The problem, atheist as well as the old Earth creationist. If the atheist provides evidence of plate movement from the fossils that occurred rapidly as I asserted, it's the evidence. Because it took less than 25 million years, because it should have been eroded away in 25 million years. It won't fit their time frame at all. The atheists won't extrapolate lunar recession backwards in time because it conflicts with their other dating system. We laid this out earlier. Again, they get into serious problems with their extrapolation. Now, right here, we have historical records of ancient solar eclipses provide a means of studying the evolution of the Earth-Moon system for the past 3,000 years. Right? From the ancient eclipse study, the rate of change in the lunar orbit semi-major axis is, now the Earth's axis is an ellipse, so it has a semi-major axis. Okay, so we have to get into studying ellipses and analytic geometry. I won't go into that. But we have 1.5 times 10 to the minus 10th. That would mean that you take this decimal point right here, and I'm highlighting with my mouse, move it 10 places over here to the left and put a decimal point and put 9 zeros before it, a decimal point and 9 zeros, and then you have the 1 5. Get rid of that 10 to the minus 10th. That means you can divide this by 1.5 divided by 10 billion. That'd be the same thing as dividing 1.5 by 10 billion. Parts and year minus 1, that means per year. That's the way of saying per year. Or recession of the moon at 5.8 centimeters per year. Now remember, 2.54 centimeters is an inch. So it's moving at a rate of 5.8 centimeters per year. Divide that by 2.54 and you'll have how many inches it is. So 2.54 times 2 is about 5 inches. So it's a little, 2 inches, I'm sorry. So a little over 2 inches. Right? And so it's a little over 2 inches per year. And it moves away from the Earth. Value for the Earth-Moon distance. Now, according to their theories, it wouldn't have moved away from the Earth in a linear fashion. They don't take that to be linear. The physics of it would not be linear. When it's closer to the Earth, it would have spun away and moved away faster. It would slow down as it moved out. So it's not linear. So don't project back that the 2 inches per year I don't project that backwards, but and that would not be valid at all. The value of the Earth Moon distance 6.69.5 million years ago is 0.840 times the present distance. This implies an average change of the lunar orbit similar major axis of 26.6 times 10 to the minus 10th, or divide 26.6 by 10 billion parts per year on an average accession of 94.5 centimeters per year. As I was saying, it's nonlinear. Okay, so that gets the moon much, much closer. Your tides will be much, much higher than they are now. And we have land tides, we have air tides. Right now, the tides in the oceans in the Bay of Fundy will get you easily 50-foot tides every day. And we have land tides, nearly about 18 or 20 inches per day. The surface of the Earth goes up and down that much. And of course, when you put the moon closer to the Earth at 0.840 times, it won't be linear again because the gravity is based upon the cube of the distance. So we have the distance cubed, I believe it is, would occur. So it would go up pretty rapidly as it got closer. So what we're saying here is the Earth should have had serious problems with very high tides, killing trees and all along the coast. And of course, the tides would have been very destructive to the land because those high tides moving in and out, large amounts of water going in and out would have caused a lot of problems of erosion for the surface of the land masses, and going across low-level islands. So to wipe out the life on that island would not let it take hold. It would have a lot of other factors. Conan Pompeii said that this is 17 times the rate from the ancient eclipse studies, and implies, if this rate is the correct long-term one, that the recent dissipation is not typical for past geologic time. Additional energy sinks may have been involved. What he's saying is, it would imply that the moon is too young. So we have to have something else happening. That's what they're claiming. He admits that he doesn't have any rocks that are near as old as he claims the Earth to be. So again, we have the rocks. There are no rocks on Earth, Guest and Greeley say, that give isotopic. So they are dating these by isotopes. And of course, that harkens back to the dating by, radiometric decay. Measurement by radioactive decay is what they're talking about. There are no rocks on Earth that give isotopic dates of older than about 3,600 million years, 3.6 billion years, what that is. We therefore have no record of the process operating on Earth for periods before that time, or this time. So they're nearly a billion years off with the rocks. In another instance, rocks from the Earth are dated a little closer to the 4.5 billion years age, but still over 500 million years off. There's another instance. Here's the side of it. Researchers have identified the Earth's oldest known rock in the remote lakes and tundra of northwest Canada, dating back 3.96 billion years. So that gets them about a little over 500 million years away from the rocks. The rocks should help scientists construct a picture of the planet's nebulous early history, which began about 4.5 billion years ago. Nebulous when you just can't get a hold of it and define it. Boring and his co-workers dated the rocks by examining the relative amounts of uranium and lead locked within the tiny zircon crystals embedded in the rock. So again, they go back to radiometric dating. This is all based on radiometric dating. So if radiometric dating is flawed, as we've already laid it out, then this whole dating technique here is not valid. None of it's true. By measuring the ratio of uranium to lead within the crystal, geologists can use a steady radioactive decay as a clock to date the crystal. So we have the steady radioactive decay. We've already dealt with that problem in our earlier studies. Though they come from the oldest known rocks, the Canadian crystals themselves are not the oldest remnants of the Earth ever found. Research today to Australian zircon crystals at almost 4.3 billion years old. So that gets closer to the dating. But how did they date them? Well, it was again by isotopes, radioactive isotopes. However, these crystals are located in much younger rock. So what does that prove? Well, it indicates they eroded from their original rock millions of years ago and were then incorporated into newer rock. That's the only assumption they can make. So they assume this. It had to have happened because it's that old. So then that proves that it's that old. See? Again, it's circular reasoning. It's an admission they don't even have rocks dated by the radiometric evidence with the supposed 4.5 billion year age of the Earth. They don't have them. They've extrapolated backwards the process and assumed the age of the Earth. They don't even have 4.5 billion year old rocks. The atheist assumes that the 4.5 billion year old rocks were melted by molten magma from below and eroded by physical processes. That's what they assume. It's all an assumption. Monostersky demonstrates a method by which the rocks are dated, as we said. I quoted him earlier, uranium-lead ratio, radiometric dating. Decay of uranium has been extrapolated backwards by the atheists and assumes that the decay rate is unchanged and is unaffected by outside influences. I'm convinced that there's sufficient evidence that the decay rate can be affected by other factors. And scientists, by having this blind spot, are failing to understand that they might have a way to accelerate the decay rate, get rid of radioactive materials from reactors. And if they could just speed up the process, they could get rid of it, or even use that process to get some energy from that. I think it's a shame that they're not looking for this, and as this is a way to get free to get energy that would not be contaminating, or they can get rid of the contaminants pretty quickly. Might be, there's a possibility. I'm not saying they can, but I'm saying that they're not looking at it, and they're blind to it. This process of dating the rock contains all the problems we discussed in chapter 12, as our studies in chapter 12. If the current geologic theory of plate tectonics is true, these zircon crystals should have been recycled. They shouldn't be there. Remember, the continents should have been eroded down to sea level in 10 to 25 million years. So they should have been eroded to sea level, and they shouldn't be there. Again, we have a problem with them. Now, this all harkens back, as I told you earlier, it goes back to the radiometric decay. Here's your basic formula. I want you to notice here we have N sub T. Now they measure the amount of the isotope of the material. That's the daughter isotope, it's called. And the N sub O is called the mother isotope. And so this is the source from which it comes. And it radiates the amount they had here of that. And E is the base for natural logarithms or Napierian logarithms, 2.718, approximately 2.71828, minus lambda T. So time, T is time, and lambda is the decay constant of the material, whether it be uranium, or radium, or whatever it might be, radioactive carbon-14, for example. N sub O is the amount of material that you had of the original material. N sub T is what you can measure. Now, N sub T, the accuracy of the measurements is probably pretty good. Not much problem with that. And of course, E is a constant. And now, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 variables. They have to assume how much they had at the beginning. Now, our problem with the assumption of this is this material should have been recycled in less than 25 million years. They should have recycled the material because it should have gone back into the oceans and been scattered back out. And so they shouldn't be able to find anything that's more than 25 million years old because of the recycling. And so that's the problem there with that. And so they make an assumption about this. And they start off, and whatever assumption you make for whatever time you want, all you got to do is assume a different value of n sub O. And of course, we've already shown that lambda, the decay rate, is affected by other factors such as heat, pressure, and other factors. And of course, neutrinos tend to trigger radioactive responsive decays. And if my theory on the sun beginning its life by gravitational contraction, and the gravitational contraction got enough heat to sustain some nuclear fusion. Now it's a combination of nuclear fusion and gravitational contraction. Then what we have is there was a time when there was almost no neutrinos coming from the sun. And of course, when the neutrinos began to accelerate and increase, then more neutrinos would trigger the decay of radioactive isotopes. And of course, we would see a non-linear, which is a change in the decay rate. So these neutrinos can trigger a decay. So our problem is, and of course, they don't have enough neutrinos to coming from the sun. That's a problem for their process. If it were totally from nuclear fusion, there ought to be a lot more neutrinos coming than are actually measured. We dealt with that question earlier too. So I want to look at this formula just one more point, and we'll be through tonight. This is an exponential decay. It follows a base E logarithmic curve. So it goes down, and I'll draw my mouse across. It goes down kind of like this. So it decays downward like this. Now we had some curves of these earlier. So it comes down in a curve like that. And that would be an exponential decay. And so it's not linear. So our problem is now we can assume, and they're not assuming linear extrapolation with these curves. If you know the formula, you can predict it accurately if there's no variables that change in the process during the process. For instance, in a chemical process, temperature will affect the process, and it'll change the action of acids and so forth. And it may speed them up or slow them down if the temperature goes up or down. And so what we get is these processes, chemical processes, for example, can change the speed of the process with pressure, pressure always increases temperature, and temperature and pressure and other factors. Same thing, I believe there's evidence that this can also affect the rate of decay of nuclear materials or radioactive materials, such as carbon-14 and uranium and so forth, your various isotopes, uranium-238, 235, and so forth. What we have then is they are not claiming it's a linear extrapolation. I understand that. But even then, they are claiming to know n sub O, and this decay rate is kept constant. No factor can affect it, that it's unchangeable. And they claim to know how much it was at the beginning. And the whole process gets stuck with this recycling of the sediment in the earth. It shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be able to find the daughter isotope with the mother isotope if it's several billion years old, because it should have been separated by the sedimentary process, the sediment. And again, this is a serious problem with them. Again, I don't think they've even considered this possibility. These are troubles for the atheistic and the old Earth creationist model. Now, this concludes our lesson for tonight. We'll look at this just in right here to explain these right here. N sub t is quantity remaining after time t. N sub O is 0 times 0 at beginning. Initial quantity of the substance. Lambda is that's Greek lambda, is the decay constant of the substance. And it's assumed to be constant, which I challenge that. And T is the time at the beginning of the decay process. Now, again, if the uranium-lead process took 25, 30, 50 million years to occur, then the uranium and the lead do the recycling of the whole continent should have been separated. They shouldn't be together. Should be able to find them together. They would have been separated from one another due to this recycling of the whole continent. That's what I'm thinking. There are four variables in this equation. They only know one of them for certain. They know N sub t. They claim that lambda is constant, which I deny. And then they have to assume N sub 0, how much there was at the beginning, but this should have been messed up due to the recycling of the continent, that is the sedimentary action into the oceans. Then from this, they solve this equation for t, how to correctly solve it, which I would agree with them. If they truly know lambda and they know N sub O, and they have N sub t, N sub t, N sub O, and they know lambda, they can accurately solve for t and extrapolate it backwards. Not linear extrapolation, but exponential, basically natural logarithm extrapolation. Now, this concludes our lesson. Are there questions or comments? I'm going to stop the recording.